Richard Hayes snatched the divorce papers off the conference table and threw them directly into his wife's face. "Sign it! You built nothing! You are nothing!" He grabbed her water glass and hurled it against the wall, then pointed at her with a finger that shook with pure contempt. 17 years of sitting in my house spending my money, and you think you deserve half of what I built." Vivian did not move. She did not blink. She simply looked at him with eyes that carried something ancient and patient and devastating. If you have been underestimated by someone who should have loved you, stay until the very end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The morning of the Hayes divorce hearing arrived the way most catastrophic days do, quietly without ceremony, wrapped inside an ordinary Atlanta sunrise that had no idea what it was introducing. The Fulton County Superior Court building stood where it always stood on Pryor Street, solid and indifferent, the kind of institutional structure that has absorbed 10,000 human disasters and revealed nothing. People moved through its corridors, carrying briefcases and manila folders, and the particular brand of controlled anxiety that courtrooms produce in almost everyone except the people who have been there enough times to stop feeling it. Richard Hayes had been there enough times. Not personally, he had always had people for that, but his company's legal team had spent years navigating contracts, disputes, and the occasional regulatory friction that came with building a $400 million enterprise from what Richard publicly described as nothing but a good idea and an iron will. He walked into courtroom 7 that morning, the way he walked into every room, like the room had been waiting for him. His suit was charcoal Brioni. His shoes were Berluti. His attorney, Arthur Gable, walked a half step behind him, the way expensive attorneys do when they want to telegraph that their client is the one who matters. Vivian Hayes was already seated at the opposing table when Richard entered. She did not turn to look at him. She was wearing a navy dress, simple, well-cut nothing that announced itself. Her attorney, Sylvia Rostova, sat beside her with a leather portfolio open on the table and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting that was too small to read from across the room. Vivian's hands were folded in her lap. Her posture was the posture of someone who had made a decision long before she walked through the door and was now simply waiting for the world to catch up. Richard looked at her and felt the familiar flicker of contempt that had become over the past 2 years of their deteriorating marriage almost a reflex. She was so quiet. She had always been so quiet. 17 years of marriage, and he could count on both hands the number of times she had raised her voice. He had taken that quietness early in their relationship for serenity. Later, he had decided it was emptiness. She had nothing to say because she had nothing to contribute. She moved through his world like a very elegant piece of furniture, present aesthetic, occasionally useful, fundamentally passive. He settled into his chair and leaned toward Arthur Gable. "How long do you think this takes?" he murmured. Arthur did not look up from his own papers. "Half a day at most. We walk through the asset structure, establish the business record, confirm the prenuptial terms. She's not contesting the prenup, which means there's not much room for argument." "She never argues," Richard said. "That's the one thing I can say for her." He said it quietly enough that it should not have carried. But courtrooms have a particular acoustic quality, and Vivian's attorney, Sylvia Rostova, glanced up from her legal pad with an expression that Richard did not bother to interpret. He had long since stopped paying attention to the reactions of people he considered irrelevant. Judge Thomas Harrison's entered at 9:14, and the room assumed its formal posture. Harrison was 61, a compact man with reading glasses he wore low on his nose, and the unhurried manner of someone who had presided over enough proceedings to have stopped being surprised by human behavior. He reviewed the case summary in front of him without visible reaction, asked both parties to confirm their representation, and opened the session. Arthur Gable began. He was the kind of attorney who made opening statements sound like foregone conclusions, and he had prepared this one with the thoroughness that Richard's retainer fee entitled him to. Hayes Global, he explained, was the product of Richard Hayes's vision, Richard Hayes's relationships, Richard Hayes's labor across 2 decades of risk-taking that his client's spouse had not shared. The prenuptial agreement signed prior to their marriage was clear, comprehensive, and entirely valid. Vivian Hayes would receive the settlement specified in that agreement, generous by any standard, Arthur noted, and the company would remain wholly in Richard's hands as it had always been. Richard watched the judge as Arthur spoke. Harrison was making notes. His face gave away very little. At the opposing table, Vivian remained still. She had not opened a file. She had not whispered to Sylvia. She was simply present, her eyes moving with a kind of patient attention from Arthur Gable to the judge, and occasionally briefly to Richard himself. Each time her gaze passed over him, it held no discernible emotion, which bothered Richard in a way he could not have named and chose not to examine. When Arthur finished, Judge Harrison looked at the opposing table. "Ms. Rostova, your opening." Sylvia Rostova stood. She was perhaps 45, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of precise diction that suggested she had trained herself out of an accent at some point and never quite lost the habit of shaping her words carefully. She was not a theatrical attorney. She did not use her hands. She simply stood and spoke in a tone that was almost conversational, as though she were explaining something to someone she expected to understand. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner has given the court a story about this company. The story is compelling, and most of it is even true. What it omits, however, is the question of who made it possible. We intend to answer that question today, and we believe the answer will change how this court evaluates every asset, every claim, and every argument the petitioner has made." She sat down. Richard turned to Arthur and made a small dismissive gesture. Arthur nodded slightly. It was the kind of opening that sounds significant but commits to nothing, and Richard had sat through enough legal theater to recognize the difference between real ammunition and performance. Vivian's attorney was performing. The case file was already established. The prenup was solid. He had married a quiet woman with modest family money and no business experience, and he had built something extraordinary while she arranged flowers and attended charity luncheons and occasionally appeared at his side at events that required a spouse. That was the story. That was the truth. He was sure of it. Arthur called Richard to testify first, which they had planned, because it controlled the narrative, and because Richard was genuinely a gifted speaker. He had given interviews to Forbes and the Atlanta Business Chronicle, and twice appeared on a morning financial program to discuss Hayes Global's growth trajectory. He knew how to talk about himself. He settled into the witness chair, adjusted the microphone, and began. He started with the beginning, which in Richard's telling was a hotel room in 2007 where he had sat with a legal pad and a vision for what the logistics and supply chain consulting industry was missing. He described the early years with the selective honesty of a man who had told this story so many times it had achieved its own internal coherence. The rejected pitches, the near misses, the moment he had secured the first real institutional client and understood that something real was being built. He was specific with numbers and impressionistic with credit, which is a technique that sounds like precision but functions like camouflage. Arthur guided him through each chapter with questions calibrated to reinforce the core argument: Richard built this. Richard risked this. Richard sacrificed weekends and vacations and the normal markers of domestic life in order to grow something that was now worth $400 million and employed over 800 people across 4 offices. And during this period, Arthur asked, "What was your wife's involvement in the business?" Richard paused for exactly the right length of time, long enough to appear to be considering the question fairly, not so long as to suggest the answer was complicated. "Vivian was supportive," he said. "She managed the household. She understood that I was building something that required everything I had. She never complained about the hours. I'll give her that." "Was she involved in any business decisions?" "No. She wasn't in that world. She didn't come from that world. She came from a family that had some money, not significant money, but comfortable, and she had no experience in finance or operations or client development. I never expected her to." "Did she have any role in securing financing or investors?" "None whatsoever." Arthur let a beat pass. "Thank you, nothing further." Judge Harrison looked across the room. "Ms. Rostova, cross-examination." Sylvia rose. She walked to a position just slightly to the left of the witness box, not directly in front of Richard, but at an angle which had the effect of making him turn his head slightly to address her, a small physical concession that subtly altered the dynamic of the exchange. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "you've described the founding of Hayes Global in considerable detail. I want to focus on one specific period, the 14 months between October 2007 and December 2008. Are you comfortable speaking about that period?" Richard looked at her steadily. "Of course. During that period, Hayes Global was incorporated. Your initial business plan was developed and your first external financing was secured. Is that accurate? That's accurate, yes. You mentioned in your direct examination that you secured the initial funding yourself. Can you describe that process for the court? Richard shifted slightly in his chair. I reached out to my network. I had built relationships over the years in the finance and investment community. I made calls, I made presentations, I made the case for what we were building. And the first institutional capital that came into Hayes Global, can you tell the court the name of the entity that provided it? Richard's eyes moved to Arthur for a fraction of a second. It was involuntary. He caught it corrected. It returned his attention to Sylvia. The initial seed capital came through a trust structure, a private investment vehicle. And the name of that vehicle? It was called, he paused, Vanguard Zenith Trust. Thank you. And did you personally have any relationship with Vanguard Zenith Trust prior to the incorporation of Hayes Global? I had been introduced to representatives of the trust through a mutual contact. Representatives, Sylvia repeated. Do you recall the name of the individual who managed the trust at the time of that investment? Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The trust used intermediaries. I dealt with the intermediaries. I see. Sylvia walked back to her table. She picked up a document from the portfolio and returned to her position. Mr. Hayes, I'm going to show you what has been marked as Petitioner's Exhibit 14. It is a certified copy of the original incorporation documents for Vanguard Zenith Trust, filed in the state of Delaware in March 2006. Do you recognize this document? She placed it in front of him. Richard looked at it. The room was very quiet. I've seen trust documentation before, he said carefully. I can't say I've seen this specific filing. I understand. I'd like to direct your attention to Section 4, which identifies the named beneficiary of the trust. Would you please read that section aloud for the court? Richard looked at the document. His eyes moved across the text. Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, but there, a hairline fracture in the confidence that had been so solid all morning. He cleared his throat. It lists a beneficiary by name. Aloud, please, Mr. Hayes. A beat. Vivian Dalton. Sylvia Rostova said nothing for a moment. She allowed the name to exist in the room on its own terms. Vivian Dalton, she repeated. That is your wife's name prior to your marriage, correct? Her maiden name, yes. So the trust that provided the seed capital for Hayes Global, the initial institutional investment that made the company's founding possible, has as its name beneficiary your wife, Vivian. Is that your understanding of what that document states? Richard's hand moved to the edge of the document and then back. I would need my attorneys to review the full document before I can... The document is certified, Sylvia said. It has been authenticated by both parties' discovery teams. You're not being asked to render legal interpretation, Mr. Hayes. You're being asked whether you understand what it states. Arthur Gable rose. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is characterizing the witness's answer. Overruled, said Judge Harrison, without looking up from his own copy of the exhibit. The witness may answer. Richard looked at Sylvia. He looked at the document. He looked briefly at Vivian, who was watching him with the same patient, unreadable expression she had worn since the hearing began. I understand what it states, he said. It was a quiet implosion. No one in the room raised their voice. No one stood dramatically. But the air in Courtroom 7 changed in a way that everyone present could feel a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, as though the room itself had registered a seismic event too deep to hear, only to sense. Richard stepped down from the witness stand and returned to his chair. He leaned toward Arthur immediately, and what passed between them was visible in body language. Alone, Arthur's stillness, Richard's insistence, the careful professional blankness Arthur maintained, even as something moved behind his eyes that had not been there 20 minutes ago. This doesn't change anything, Richard said under his breath. Arthur did not respond immediately. Arthur, this does not change anything. It's a trust. A named beneficiary doesn't mean, let me listen to what she presents, Arthur said quietly. We'll respond after. Richard settled back. He picked up his pen. He pressed it between his fingers with a force that was not entirely controlled, and he watched Sylvia Rostova return to her table with the unhurried precision of someone who had only just begun. At the opposing table, Vivian had not moved. She had not permitted herself even the smallest visible reaction to the moment that had just occurred. She had practiced this. She had rehearsed stillness the way other people rehearse speeches. She understood with a clarity that had come to her slowly over the past 2 years, and then all at once, that the most powerful thing she could do in this room was nothing. The impulse was there. The satisfaction was there, coiled and warm when she heard Richard read her maiden name from that document. 17 years of silence. Not the passive silence he had always attributed to her. Not the silence of a woman without thoughts or plans or understanding, but the deliberate silence of a woman who had learned very early that people reveal themselves completely when they believe no one important is watching. Richard had never believed she was important. That was the misunderstanding. That was the one mistake threaded through every year of their marriage that had made this moment inevitable. She remembered the morning they had discussed the trust. She had been 31. Her grandfather, James Dalton, had died 8 months earlier, leaving the Dalton shipping fortune structured through a series of private trusts that her family's attorneys had spent the better part of a decade designing for exactly this kind of protection, the protection of wealth from the kind of volatility that could come from association, marriage business risk. The Vanguard Zenith Trust was her inheritance, restructured. It had been her grandfather's idea originally, and then her mother's, and finally hers. When Richard had come to her in 2007, burning with the idea for Hayes Global, she had seen something real in it. She had also seen something she recognized from her grandfather's stories about her own family's origins, a person with genuine talent who was also profoundly unaware of how much invisible support made talent legible. Her grandfather had been supported by a network of relationships and resources he had not always fully credited. Richard would be no different. She had made a decision. She had not made it impulsively. She had sat with her family's attorneys for 6 weeks, discussing structures, discussing contingencies, discussing the specific legal architecture that would allow her to support Richard's company without triggering the disclosure clauses in the prenuptial agreement she had asked her own attorneys to review before signing. The prenuptial agreement Richard had presented her 2 months before their wedding, the one he had been so proud of, so certain was a fortress protecting his imaginary future wealth from a woman he had not yet built anything with. She had read that agreement with the kind of attention that comes from having grown up in a family where legal documents were treated with the respect most people reserve for sacred texts. She had made no changes to it. She had signed it precisely as presented. Because she had understood something, Richard had not the agreement protected assets that were held in his name. It said nothing could say nothing about assets she held independently. She had funded his company through a trust that bore her name. She had done it with care and with genuine belief in what he was building. And she had watched across 17 years as he built an identity around a story that erased her almost entirely. She had thought for a long time that she could live with it. She had not built it for the credit. She had built it because she believed in the potential, and she had not needed him to know. But credit over time has a way of calcifying into identity, and the man who sat across the courtroom from her now had become someone who genuinely believed his own mythology. He believed it with the total conviction of a person who has never been seriously questioned. She had begun to understand perhaps 3 years ago that this was not a marriage any longer. It was a performance he was giving to an audience that consisted almost entirely of himself. Judge Harrison called a 15-minute recess just after 11 o'clock. The courtroom stirred. People stood stretched, moved toward the doors, with the restless energy of people who had been sitting still and processing difficult information simultaneously. Richard did not stand immediately. He sat in his chair with the document still in front of him, Petitioner's Exhibit 14, and he read it again. He was reading it the way a man reads a map when he suspects the map has been drawn wrong, methodically examining each element as though the error must be present and findable if he only looks carefully enough. Arthur had stepped away to make a phone call. Through the glass panel on the courtroom door, Richard could see him standing in the corridor speaking with the focused economy of someone conducting damage assessment. Across the room, Sylvia was speaking quietly to Vivian. He watched them without trying to appear to be watching. Vivian was nodding slowly. She had taken a small bottle of water from her bag and was holding it without drinking from it. She looked like someone sitting in a waiting room, serene, self-contained, outside the turbulence of the room she was at the center of. Richard had spent 17 years reading her silence as absence. He was beginning to understand in a way that was not yet fully formed that he had been catastrophically wrong. The understanding had not arrived all at once. It was coming in pieces, each piece landing with the quiet weight of something solid. And together they were assembling into a picture he had not seen before and could not now look away from. The trust bore her name. The trust had funded his company. If the trust controlled the founding capital, then what did the trust control now? He picked up his phone and typed a message to Arthur. What does the trust structure mean for the ownership split? Across the room, Sylvia said something that made Vivian smile, small, contained, private. Richard had not seen Vivian smile in almost 2 years. It was a different kind of smile than he remembered. Arthur came back through the door before Richard's phone showed a reply. "Talk to me," Richard said immediately. Arthur sat down, arranged his papers with a precision that Richard recognized as a stalling behavior. "The trust documentation is authenticated. I spoke to Marcus. He's pulling the secondary filings now." The secondary filings. The trust incorporated with controlling shares in Hayes Global's parent structure. If the filing is what it appears to be, what does it appear to be, Arthur? Arthur looked at him directly for the first time since the exhibit had been entered. It appears to be a 51% controlling interest in the entity that owns Hayes Global, held through Vanguard Zenith Trust, with your wife as the named beneficiary. The recess ended. Judge Harrison returned. The room reassembled itself. Richard sat through the next hour with the particular stillness of a man who is managing something enormous happening inside him by refusing to let any of it surface. He answered questions when Arthur redirected him for clarification. He made notes on a legal pad that he did not look at again after writing them. He sat. And Vivian across the room was the calmest person in the building. She had been the calmest person in the building since she arrived. She had been calm because she had known every piece of what was about to happen, and she had known it for long enough that the emotion had moved through her and resolved into something quieter and harder. Not anger, not triumph, but a kind of settled clarity that comes from having made a decision with full understanding of its consequences. She had spent 2 years preparing for this day. She had spent those 2 years the way she had spent most of her life, quietly, thoroughly, invisibly. And Richard, as he sat across from her, trying to reconstruct a story that was dissolving in front of him, was only beginning to understand that the silence he had spent 17 years misreading had not been absence. It had been preparation. Arthur Gable had been practicing law for 31 years, and in those 31 years he had learned to read a courtroom the way a sailor reads water, not by what was visible on the surface, but by the particular quality of the stillness underneath. What he felt in Courtroom 7 during that 15-minute recess was not stillness. It was the held breath of a room that had just witnessed something it had not expected and was not yet sure how to process. He returned to the table where Richard was sitting with Exhibit 14 still in front of him, and the expression of a man who has just discovered a structural flaw in a building he has been living in for 17 years. "Walk me through your exposure," Arthur said quietly, sitting down and opening his portfolio. "There is no exposure," Richard said. "It's a trust document. Trusts have named beneficiaries. That doesn't mean she controls anything." "Richard, she signed a prenuptial agreement. That agreement is airtight. You told me it was airtight. The prenuptial agreement covers assets held in your name and assets acquired during the marriage in your name. It does not address assets held independently by your spouse in structures predating the marriage." Arthur kept his voice low and level. "If the trust predates your marriage, and the trust holds a controlling interest in the parent company of Hayes Global, the prenuptial agreement may be entirely irrelevant to that portion of the asset structure." Richard stared at him. "Say that again?" "The prenup protects what is yours. If this trust was never yours, if it was always hers, structured in her name before you ever incorporated, then the prenup has nothing to say about it." The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. Richard counted them without meaning to. "She funded my company," he said. His voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. "She sat across from me at dinner for 17 years and never said a word, and she funded my company." "That appears to be what the documentation shows. Why would she do that and say nothing?" Arthur looked at him with the careful neutrality of an attorney who has opinions he is not being paid to share. "That is a question for another day. Right now, I need you to tell me everything you know about the operational history of that trust and any communications you may have had, directly or indirectly, with anyone connected to it." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I dealt with intermediaries, a firm called Castellan Advisory. They represented the trust in all the early financing conversations. I never had any reason to think that Vivian was connected to Castellan or to Vanguard Zenith." "Did Vivian ever mention Castellan Advisory to you?" Richard thought. He pressed his memory the way you press a bruise, with the specific intention of finding exactly where it hurts. "Once," he said slowly, "maybe 3 years after we incorporated. She mentioned she had a meeting with someone from a financial advisory firm. I didn't ask who. I didn't think it was relevant." He paused. "I didn't think she had relevant meetings." Arthur wrote something on his legal pad. Judge Harrison returned to the bench at 11:47, and the room settled back into its formal arrangement. Arthur had spent the final 3 minutes of the recess on the phone with his associate Marcus Webb, who had been running a parallel document review since before the hearing began, and who delivered in the compressed language of someone reading, while talking a summary that Arthur was still absorbing when he sat back down. Sylvia Rostova stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to call our first witness." Harrison nodded. "The petitioner calls Dr. Eleanor Marsh." A woman entered from the corridor, mid-50s, silver-haired, carrying a leather satchel with the brisk efficiency of someone for whom time is a professional resource. She was a forensic financial analyst, Sylvia established, through a rapid series of qualification questions with 23 years of experience and a client list that included 3 federal investigations and 1 landmark corporate fraud case that Richard vaguely remembered reading about in the journal 4 years ago. He did not like the look of her. "Dr. Marsh," Sylvia said, "you were engaged by our office to conduct a financial analysis of Hayes Global's corporate history ownership structure and capital flow from its founding through the present. Is that correct?" "That is correct." "And in the course of that analysis, what did you find with respect to the entity known as Vanguard Zenith Trust?" Eleanor Marsh opened her satchel and removed a bound report with the unhurried confidence of someone who has given expert testimony enough times to know that PACE is its own form of authority. Vanguard Zenith Trust was incorporated in Delaware in March 2006. It was established with an initial capitalization of approximately $42 million, sourced from the liquidation of a series of legacy assets belonging to the Dalton family shipping interests. The named beneficiary was Vivian Dalton, subsequently Vivian Dalton Hayes. And what was the trust's relationship to Hayes Global? In October 2007, Vanguard Zenith Trust provided the initial seed capital for Hayes Global in the amount of $8.3 million. This investment was structured as a convertible note with an equity conversion clause triggered upon the company reaching a valuation threshold. That threshold was reached in 2011. Upon conversion, the trust held equity in Hayes Global's parent holding company, HG Partners, LLC. What percentage of equity? 51%. The number landed in the room the way numbers sometimes do in courtrooms, not with drama, but with weight. A jurisprudential gravity that pulled everything else slightly off its axis. Arthur was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing the legal meaning of financial instruments without—" "Dr. Marsh is describing the percentage recorded in the equity conversion documents," Sylvia said, "which are authenticated and in evidence as Exhibits 15 through 22. "Overruled," said Harrison. "Continue." Richard had stopped writing on his legal pad. His pen was resting at an angle against the table, and he was watching Eleanor Marsh with the focused attention of a man trying to identify the exact mechanism of something that is happening to him against his will. 51%, Sylvia repeated for the record. "Dr. Marsh, what does a 51% controlling interest in HG Partners, LLC mean in practical terms for the ownership of Hayes Global? It means that the holder of that interest has ultimate controlling authority over Hayes Global's major corporate decisions, including executive appointments, asset dispositions, and strategic direction. It is in effect the controlling ownership position in the company. And that interest is held by Vanguard Zenith Trust. Correct. The trust whose named beneficiary is Vivian Dalton Hayes. Correct. Sylvia paused. She let the room sit in that for a moment. Across the aisle, Arthur was writing rapidly. Richard was not writing anything. He was looking at Vivian. Vivian was looking at Dr. Marsh. Now, Sylvia continued, I want to ask you about a separate line of analysis. In reviewing Hayes Global's operational history, did you find any evidence of financial irregularities? The question arrived without fanfare, delivered in the same conversational register as everything before it, and it took the room a half-second to register the shift in direction. Richard's head turned back toward the witness stand. We did, said Eleanor Marsh. Can you describe what you found? In the course of reviewing Hayes Global's financial records bank statements and the records of several affiliated entities, we identified a pattern of transactions that appear inconsistent with legitimate business operations. She opened to a tabbed section of her report. Specifically, we identified transfers totaling $14.6 million made over a period of 7 years to an offshore entity registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Paravel Holdings, LLC. Arthur was on his feet again before she finished the sentence. Objection, Your Honor. This line of testimony is entirely outside the scope of a dissolution proceeding. The petitioner is attempting to introduce what amounts to an unsubstantiated fraud allegation in a— Your Honor, Sylvia said, her voice remaining completely level. The financial integrity of the marital estate is directly relevant to asset valuation and equitable division. The origin and destination of $14.6 million that passed through the marital estate is not outside scope. It is the scope. Harrison looked at Arthur. He looked at Sylvia. He removed his reading glasses, cleaned them with a cloth he produced from somewhere beneath the bench, replaced them, and said, Overruled. The witness will continue. Richard leaned toward Arthur as Arthur sat back down. She does not have our internal financial records. Those were not part of discovery. Arthur's voice was very quiet. She has whatever was produced in discovery, and she has whatever a forensic analyst can derive from cross-referencing external sources, bank filings, regulatory submissions, registered agent records. Tell me right now, Richard. Tell me what Paravel Holdings is. A pause that lasted too long. It's a consulting entity, Richard said. Is it your entity? Another pause. It's structured through a series of— Richard, is it your entity? Yes. Arthur closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and returned his attention to the witness stand with the professional composure of a man who has absorbed worse surprises in courtrooms and survived them, though perhaps none quite this specifically catastrophic. Eleanor Marsh continued without needing to be prompted. Paravel Holdings, LLC, was registered in the Cayman Islands in 2014. The registered agent is a firm called Meridian Corporate Services, which also administers a portfolio of entities with no disclosed beneficial owners. However, financial tracing through correspondent banking records and subpoenaed wire transfer documentation identifies the controlling party of Paravel Holdings as Richard Allen Hayes. And the $14.6 million transferred to Paravel, what did your analysis reveal about those funds? The transfers appear to represent a combination of inflated vendor invoices payments made by Hayes Global to Paravel for consulting services that our analysis found no operational evidence to support, and a series of personal expense reimbursements categorized as business expenses, including property purchases, luxury vehicle acquisitions, and what appear to be personal travel costs, totaling approximately $1.8 million over the review period. She said it the way a physician describes a diagnosis, not unkindly, but without softening the facts to protect the patient from them. The courtroom was very quiet. Richard felt the quiet, the way you feel cold water as a total physical sensation, not localized, but everywhere at once, So, to summarize, Sylvia said, your analysis found that the controlling interest in Hayes Global belongs to a trust in Vivian Hayes' name, and that approximately $14.6 million was diverted from Hayes Global through an offshore entity controlled by Richard Hayes. Is that an accurate summary? That is an accurate summary of our findings, yes, Sylvia said. Nothing further. Harrison looked at Arthur. Cross-examination. Arthur stood. He approached Eleanor Marsh with the measured pace of an attorney who is not panicking because he has trained himself not to panic in public, regardless of what is happening in private. He spent 12 minutes challenging the methodology of the financial, tracing the authentication chain for the offshore banking records, and the characterization of vendor relationships that he argued were legitimate consulting arrangements inadequately reviewed. Eleanor Marsh answered each challenge with the patient specificity of someone who had anticipated every question and prepared for it. She did not become defensive. She did not become uncertain. She simply answered, and each answer closed the opening Arthur had attempted to create. When Arthur sat down, he placed his pen on the table with a deliberateness that Richard recognized as a man accepting a situation. Richard looked across the room at Vivian for the second time in the last hour. She was watching him now. Not with triumph, not with anger, with something that was harder to bear than either of those things, a kind of sorrowful recognition, as though she had known this moment was coming for long enough that it had moved past drama into something quieter and more final. He thought about the morning she had mentioned Castellan Advisory. He was now certain with the cold certainty of retrospect that she had mentioned it deliberately. A small signal. A moment of transparency she had offered perhaps in case he wanted to ask. He had not asked. He had not asked because he had not believed the answer could matter. He had spent 17 years not believing her answers could matter. Judge Harrison called a lunch recess at 12:22, and the room exhaled in the collective way rooms do when the pressure inside them has been building long enough to become almost atmospheric. Richard sat while everyone else moved. Arthur gathered his materials and stepped out to make calls. The gallery, a small one, only a handful of attorneys and one journalist from the Business Chronicle who had somehow caught wind of the filing, filed toward the doors with the careful nonchalance of people trying not to appear as riveted as they were. Vivian smoothed her navy dress and said something quietly to Sylvia. Sylvia nodded and began repacking the portfolio. Then Vivian turned, and for the first time since the hearing began, she looked directly at Richard across the empty space between their tables. She did not walk toward him. She did not speak. She simply looked at him for a moment, steady, clear-eyed, without malice, and then she turned and walked toward the door. "Vivian." His voice came out before he had decided to use it. She stopped. She turned back just slightly, just enough. "Did you know," he said, "from the beginning, did you know it would come to this?" She considered the question. He could see her considering it, not performing consideration, actually doing it, giving his question the genuine attention she had always given things he had dismissed. "I knew what you were capable of," she said. "Both things, the building and the taking." She paused. "I hoped for a long time that the building would win." She walked out. Richard sat alone in the courtroom for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the wall with the specific focus of a man who has nothing else to look at and cannot look inside himself yet because what is inside is too large and too recent to examine. $14.6 million. His own hand reaching into his own company, except that it had never apparently been entirely his own company, and taking and taking and taking, with the confidence of a man who believes the taking is his right because the building was his alone. Except the building had not been his alone. He thought about the $8.3 million that had arrived in Hayes Global's account in October 2007 from Castellan Advisory, representing Vanguard Zenith Trust. He had celebrated that funding with a bottle of Opus One that he had opened alone in his office because there was no one else present who had done what he had done to earn it. He had told that story for years, the funding call the term sheet, the moment he knew the company was real. He had told it to journalists and investors and employees, and at dinners where Vivian sat beside him and never corrected a single word. She had sat beside him and never corrected a single word. He had believed it was because she had nothing to correct. He was beginning to understand it was because she had made a different calculation entirely, the calculation of a woman who understood that the moment to speak was not when speaking was merely justified, but when speaking was decisive. When Arthur returned at 1:45, 15 minutes before the afternoon session was set to begin, Richard told him about Paravel in full. Not the managed version he had offered during the recess, the full version. The initial invoice structure, the personal expense categories, the property in Hilton Head that was technically owned by a Paravel subsidiary and that Richard used 4 or 5 weekends a year. He told it with the compressed efficiency of a man who understands that the inventory is about to be taken whether he participates or not, and that participation is the only remaining form of control available to him. Arthur listened without interrupting. When Richard finished, Arthur looked at his legal pad for a moment and then looked up. "Is there anything else?" Arthur said. "No." "Richard, is there anything else?" A pause. "There's a property in Scottsdale, same structure." Arthur wrote it down. "The situation," Arthur said carefully, "has changed materially from what we discussed in preparation. The trust documentation establishes your wife's controlling interest in a way that significantly complicates the asset division argument. The Paravel disclosures, if they are as Dr. Marsh characterized them, create exposure that extends beyond this proceeding. What kind of exposure? Financial fraud, wire transfer violations, depending on how the offshore structure is characterized, potentially federal." He let that sit for exactly the length of time required for it to be understood. "I would advise you very strongly to consider whether continuing to contest this proceeding aggressively is in your best interest, or whether a different posture, a posture oriented toward resolution rather than victory, might better serve what remains of your position." Richard looked at him. "You're telling me to settle." "I'm telling you that the landscape has changed and that your options are different than they were this morning. This morning I walked in here to get a clean divorce from a woman who contributed nothing to what I built." Arthur's expression did not change. "And this afternoon the record reflects that the woman contributed the capital that made the building possible and that you diverted $14.6 million from the company she funded." He paused. "The landscape has changed." Richard said nothing for a long moment. Outside the courtroom windows, Atlanta continued its afternoon in complete indifference to what was happening on the 7th floor of the Fulton County Superior Court. Traffic moved. The sun was past its apex and beginning the slow decline toward the western horizon. In the building across the street, someone was eating lunch at a desk visible from the window. "I built that company," Richard said, not defensively, quietly, almost to himself. "Whatever the structure was, whatever trust was behind it, I built it. 14 years of my life, 800 people working in 4 offices. I built that." "I know you did," Arthur said. "She sat there for 17 years and watched me build it and never told me she was funding it." "I know. What kind of person does that?" Arthur picked up his pen. He considered the question with the genuine thoughtfulness of someone who has across 31 years developed opinions about the varieties of human motivation he encounters in courtrooms. "The kind," he said finally, "who understood exactly what they were doing and exactly why, and was patient enough to wait for the moment it became necessary to say so." The afternoon session began at 2 o'clock, and Sylvia Rostova was not finished. She called one more witness, a woman named Patricia Ellison, who had served as the chief financial officer of Hayes Global for 9 years before leaving in 2021. Patricia Ellison was 53 years old and had the precise, careful affect of a person who has thought very hard about what she is about to say and has decided to say it anyway. She described in response to Sylvia's questions 3 separate instances in which Hayes Global had faced liquidity crises serious enough to threaten operations and 3 separate instances in which capital had arrived through Castellan Advisory to stabilize the company's position. "Did you know at the time where that capital originated?" Sylvia asked. "I knew it came from the trust," Patricia said. "I did not know the trust's beneficiary. That was not information I was given." "And in your experience as CFO, how significant were those capital injections to the company's survival?" Patricia looked directly at the judge rather than at counsel when she answered. "Without those 3 interventions, Hayes Global would not exist today. I am confident of that. Richard heard it the way you hear something you have been afraid to hear for a long time, not as new information exactly, but as a confirmation that your fear was correct. He had known in the deep, wordless place where the real accounting of a business life happens that there had been moments when the company should have failed and had not. He had attributed it to luck, to timing, to the particular resilience of something that was meant to survive. He had never looked too hard at the mechanics of the survival because the mechanics had always ultimately resolved. He had never looked too hard because looking hard would have required asking questions he did not want to ask of people who might give him answers he did not want to have. Vivian had known that about him too. She had known it the way she knew most things about him, quietly, completely, without making a production of the knowing. When Patricia Ellison stepped down and Sylvia indicated that the respondent's presentation was complete for the day, Judge Harrison reviewed his notes for a long moment. The room waited with the specific quality of attention that courtrooms develop when a judgment is being formed. "We'll resume tomorrow morning at 9, Harrison said. "At that time I'll hear closing arguments and render findings." He looked over his glasses at both tables with equal measure. "Counsel should come prepared to address the trust documentation, the equity structure, and the financial irregularities identified in Dr. Marsh's testimony, all of it." He rose. The room rose with him. And Richard Hayes sat for the second time that day, slightly longer than everyone else, before pushing back his chair and standing to face what the morning had become. Richard did not sleep that night. He lay in the bedroom of the Buckhead house, the house that was, he now understood technically, an asset of the marital estate and subject to proceedings he no longer controlled the narrative of. And he stared at the ceiling with the specific wakefulness of a man whose mind refuses to stop running the same calculation because the calculation keeps producing an answer he cannot accept. 51%. He ran it forward and backward. He examined it from every angle available to a man lying alone in the dark with nothing but his own thoughts and 17 years of assumptions that had just been formally demolished in a courtroom on Pryor Street. 51% of HG Partners, LLC, the holding entity, which meant 51% of everything underneath it, which meant that Vivian Dalton Hayes, who had sat across dinner tables and at charity events and in the passenger seat of his car for 17 years without once correcting his version of the story, held the controlling interest in the company he had built, had believed he had built. The distinction was becoming in the dark of that bedroom the most important distinction of his life. At 2:47 in the morning, he called Arthur Gable. He knew it was inexcusable. He called anyway. Arthur answered on the fourth ring with the alert, clipped tone of a man who has been waiting for a call he knew was coming. "Richard." "The Hilton Head property," Richard said, "and Scottsdale. Are those going to surface tomorrow?" "They will surface before tomorrow. Marcus has been in contact with opposing counsel as part of the document exchange the judge ordered before close of session. Sylvia Rostova already has the registration filings." Richard sat up. "How much does she have?" "Enough. She has enough." Arthur paused. "Richard, I need you to be in this office at 7 tomorrow morning, not 7:30. 7. We need to discuss your options before we walk back into that courtroom, because what you walk in prepared to do tomorrow will determine what the next 18 months of your life look like. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." 7 o'clock. Richard set his phone down on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and he thought about Vivian. Not about the trust or the equity or the offshore accounts. He thought about her face in the courtroom when she had turned back to answer his question. He thought about what she had said. "I knew what you were capable of. Both things. The building and the taking." She had known. She had known about Paravel, or suspected it. She had known, and she had waited, and she had let the forensic trail accumulate with the patience of a woman who understood that time properly used is not the enemy of justice, but its instrument. He had always thought of her patience as passivity. He understood now in the thorough and devastating way that understanding sometimes arrives that he had never in 17 years correctly identified a single thing about Vivian Dalton Hayes. He was at Arthur's office at 6:58. Arthur was already there with Marcus Webb and a third attorney. Richard had not previously met a woman named Dana Croft, who was introduced as a specialist in federal financial compliance matters. The presence of Dana Croft told Richard everything he needed to know about how Arthur assessed the situation before Richard had said a single word. They worked for an hour and 40 minutes. Dana Croft walked him through the exposure analysis with the systematic thoroughness of someone who deals in consequences professionally and has learned not to soften them unnecessarily. The Paravel structure, as she characterized it, created potential liability under wire fraud statutes, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, depending on how certain Cayman transactions were characterized, and a separate line of exposure related to the misrepresentation of business expenses in Hayes Global's audited financials. The last item was the one that made Richard's chest feel genuinely tight, because audited financials meant external auditors, and external auditors meant a paper trail that existed entirely outside his control. "What's the realistic range?" Richard asked. Dana Croft looked at him steadily. "If this goes federal and the referral from the family court creates a significant probability that it will, you are looking at a range that begins at substantial civil penalties and moves upward depending on prosecutorial discretion and cooperation." She paused. "Cooperation is a meaningful variable." "Meaning if I cooperate?" "Meaning how you conduct yourself in that courtroom today and in any subsequent proceedings will be observed and weighted by people whose decisions will affect your life considerably more than Judge Harrison's divorce ruling." Richard looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back at him with the calm of a man who has said everything he needs to say and is now waiting for his client to arrive at the necessary conclusion on his own. "What do you recommend?" Richard asked. "I recommend," Arthur said, "that you do not walk into that courtroom this morning and continue fighting a battle the record has already decided. I recommend that you instruct me to communicate to opposing counsel that you are prepared to discuss a resolution framework. I recommend that you demonstrate today that you understand the difference between the position you held yesterday morning and the position you hold right now." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "And the company?" No one answered immediately. "The company," Dana Croft said carefully, "is a separate question from the personal liability. The company's future will be determined by its controlling ownership, which the record now clearly identifies. Your role within that structure going forward is not something we can negotiate this morning." He heard it for what it was. He had heard Arthur's version of it the previous afternoon, but hearing it stated plainly by a federal compliance attorney in a conference room at 7 in the morning landed differently than it had in the filtered light of a courtroom recess. He had built Hayes Global. He had spent 14 years of his life inside that company, its early chaos, its near collapses, its genuine achievements, the 800 people who came to work in its offices because he had built something worth coming to work for. Whatever the trust structure said, whatever Vivian's controlling interest meant on paper, the living substance of the company had been his labor, his relationships, his vision executed across thousands of working days. And he had also stolen from it. That was the word. He had told himself other words: restructured, managed, allocated, but sitting in a conference room with a federal compliance attorney. At 7 in the morning, the correct word was available to him in a way it had not previously been. He had stolen from the company that someone else had funded and that he had built, and that together they had made into something worth $400 million. He had stolen from it in the precise way that a person steals who believes the taking is justified by the building, which is to say, with confidence and over time, and without ever fully examining the action directly. "All right," he said. "Talk to Rostova." Arthur nodded once and reached for his phone. They arrived at the courthouse at 8:40. Arthur had spoken with Sylvia Rostova's office at 7:55, and Sylvia had listened to the summary of Richard's position and said she would convey it to her client and respond before the session opened. What she had not said, what Arthur reported to Richard in the car on the way to the courthouse, was any indication of how Vivian would receive it. "She'll want the trust intact," Richard said, "unquestionably. And the company. She already has the company. The question is what she does with you. The question of what Vivian would do with him." Richard turned it over in his mind as they rode the elevator to the 7th floor. He thought about what she had said. "I hoped for a long time that the building would win," and he tried to read the architecture of a decision in those words. She was not a vindictive person. He had known her for 19 years, and in 19 years he had never seen her act from vindictiveness. She was something more patient and more difficult than vindictive. She was principled, which in practice was considerably harder to negotiate with than vindictive, because vindictive people have limits that principle does not. Sylvia Rostova was waiting in the corridor outside courtroom 7 when they arrived. She was alone. Vivian had not yet appeared. "My client has received your client's communication," Sylvia said. She was speaking directly to Arthur with the professional containment of someone conducting a conversation that will have legal implications. "She is willing to hear a formal proposal. She is not willing to delay the session or modify the proceedings based on a general indication of willingness to resolve. If your client has a proposal, it needs to be specific and it needs to be on the table before Judge Harrison opens." Arthur said, "We can be specific." "Then be specific." They stood in the corridor for 22 minutes. Richard stood slightly apart because the conversation his attorney was having with opposing counsel was not a conversation that benefited from his direct participation, and because he needed the 22 minutes to do something he had not done in a very long time: stand still and let reality land on him without immediately constructing a response to it. The corridor of the Fulton County Superior Court was not a place designed for contemplation. People moved through it with the purposeful distraction of people who had places to be and cases to manage. A bailiff walked past with a cart. 2 young attorneys conferred over a phone screen. Somewhere down the hall, someone was having an argument in a lowered voice that carried anyway. Richard stood in the middle of it and thought about the morning in 2007 when he had sat in a hotel room with a legal pad and the genuine clean excitement of a person who has just identified something real. The idea had been real. The vision had been real. 14 years later, 800 people came to work every day because he had held that vision long enough and hard enough to make it material. That was also real. Both things were real, the building and the taking. Vivian had named it correctly, the way she named most things, without drama, with precision, and, at exactly the moment when naming it, served the purpose she had decided it needed to serve. At 9:03, Sylvia turned from Arthur and looked at Richard directly for the first time. "My client will be here in 4 minutes. She asked me to tell you one thing before we go in." Richard waited. "She said the offer is acceptable, and she wants you to know it is not about punishment. It was never about punishment." He did not know what to do with that. He nodded because it was the only response available. Vivian arrived at 9:06. She was wearing a different dress than yesterday, dark gray, equally simple, and she walked down the corridor with Sylvia at her side and her eyes forward until she was 3 feet from Richard, at which point she stopped and looked at him. "Richard," she said. "Vivian." A pause that contained 17 years and the ruins of a story and something else underneath the ruins that neither of them had a word for yet. "Are you all right?" she said. It was so unexpected that for a moment he didn't respond. "Am I?" He stopped. "You're asking me if I'm all right." "I am." "After everything that happened yesterday." "After everything that happened yesterday," she confirmed. Her voice was even. Her eyes were serious and clear and not unkind. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said in 2 days. "I genuinely don't know." She nodded as though this was the correct answer. Then she walked past him toward the courtroom doors. Judge Harrison opened the session at 9:15. He reviewed the docket, confirmed both parties were present, and looked up. "I understand counsel has had communications this morning regarding a possible resolution framework. Is that accurate?" Arthur stood. "Your Honor, that is accurate. The respondent has indicated a willingness to engage with a structured resolution that addresses the primary asset questions, as well as the matters raised by Dr. Marsh's testimony yesterday. We are prepared to present specific terms." Sylvia stood. "The petitioner is prepared to receive those terms and respond." Harrison looked between them. "I'll allow it. Let's hear what you have." What followed was 40 minutes of the most concentrated legal negotiation Richard had ever witnessed, conducted in the open air of a courtroom rather than behind closed doors. Arthur presented the terms. Sylvia responded, modified, rejected specific elements, and accepted others. The judge occasionally asked clarifying questions or noted issues for the record. Richard sat and watched his company and his marriage, and the last 17 years of his life being described, assessed, and reorganized in real time by people whose professional language had a precision that his own thinking in its current state entirely lacked. The terms that emerged were as follows. The prenuptial agreement would be honored in its original form. Vivian would retain full ownership of the Vanguard Zenith Trust and its 51% controlling interest in HG Partners, LLC. Richard would retain his personal assets, as defined by the prenuptial agreement, less any amounts determined to have been improperly diverted through Paravel Holdings. The Paravel matter would be referred to federal authorities for independent assessment, with Richard's cooperation formally noted in the record. His position as CEO of Hayes Global would be terminated immediately, with a transition plan to be managed by the board under Vivian's authority as controlling shareholder. When Arthur finished presenting the final synthesized terms, the courtroom was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Harrison reviewed his notes. He asked 2 clarifying questions about the Paravel referral mechanism. He confirmed that both parties understood the terms as presented. Then he looked at Vivian. Mrs. Hayes, you are the petitioner and the controlling party in this resolution. I want to hear from you directly. Are these terms as you understand them, and do you accept them? Vivian stood. She had not spoken in this courtroom since the proceedings began. She had not testified, had not made statements for the record, had not once raised her voice or interjected, or done any of the things that the room might have expected from a woman in her position. She had sat, and she had watched, and she had let her attorney and her documents speak on her behalf, because that had been the correct instrument for each moment. This moment required her voice. Yes, Your Honor, she said. These are the terms as I understand them, and I accept them. Harrison looked at Richard. Mr. Hayes, same question. Richard stood. He was aware of Arthur beside him, of Sylvia across the aisle, of the journalist from the Business Chronicle in the gallery, who was writing with the focused speed of someone capturing something significant. He was aware of Vivian standing a few feet away, with her hands at her sides, and her posture the posture of someone who has been patient long enough that patience has become simply the way they exist in the world. He thought about the hotel room in 2007. He thought about the 800 people in 4 offices. He thought about $14.6 million that he had told himself across 7 years was simply the prerogative of the person who had built the thing that was generating it. He thought about Vivian's face in the corridor. Are you all right, after everything? Yes, he said. I accept the terms. Harrison made a notation. He looked at both tables one final time with the steady gaze of a man who has spent his career in the presence of human failure and human resilience and has learned to hold both with the same measured attention. The court accepts the terms as stated. I'll have the formal findings prepared for signature by end of day. In addition, the financial matters identified in Dr. Marsh's testimony will be referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia for independent review. He paused. This proceeding is adjourned. The gavel came down, and in the particular silence that followed, the silence of a room in which something large and irrevocable has just concluded, Richard Hayes stood at his table and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle onto him with the unhurried completeness of something that has been building for a very long time. Across the aisle, Vivian was accepting a handshake from Sylvia, who said something quiet that made Vivian nod. Then Sylvia stepped back to gather her materials, and Vivian turned. She picked up her bag. She straightened her jacket. She walked toward the door with the measured, unhurried stride of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has known for a long time. At the door she paused. She turned back one final time, and her eyes found Richard's across the length of the courtroom. It was not a triumphant look. It was not a forgiving look. It was the look of a woman who has done what she came to do and is now ready to walk out into the rest of her life, which is waiting for her on the other side of that door. Then she turned back and pushed through and was gone. Richard stood in the emptying courtroom for a long moment. The journalist was leaving. The bailiff was resetting the room. Arthur had his hand on Richard's arm and was saying something in a low, practical voice about next steps in federal counsel and the specific logistics of transition, all of which was real and important and would need to be addressed very soon. But Richard Hayes stood still for one more moment in the room where everything he had believed about himself and his life, and the story of what he had built, had been examined, measured, and found to be something considerably more complicated than he had ever allowed himself to know. The silence in the room was different from the silence Vivian had inhabited for 17 years. That silence had been full of knowledge and patience and the particular power of a woman who understands that the moment to speak is not the moment others expect. This silence was empty. It was the silence of a story that had just ended and an accounting that had just begun. The formal findings landed on Richard's desk at 4:47 that afternoon, delivered by courier to Arthur Gable's office, where Richard had been sitting since noon, working through the specific logistics of a life being disassembled in real time. The document was 11 pages. Arthur had already read it twice. Richard read it once slowly with the particular attention of a man who understands that every word on every page is now the architecture of his immediate future. The language was precise and without sentiment, which was appropriate because what had happened in Courtroom 7 that morning was not a sentimental event. It was a legal reckoning, and legal reckonings speak in the grammar of findings and orders and directives, not in the grammar of what people feel about them. Richard signed where Arthur indicated. His hand was steady. He had passed through the stage of trembling sometime around 3 in the morning and come out the other side into a territory he did not have a name for yet, not acceptance, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The territory of a man who has run out of positions to defend and is now simply standing in the open, waiting to understand what standing in the open actually means. Arthur walked him through the transition timeline. Richard had 14 days to vacate the Hayes Global executive offices. His access to company systems would be suspended at midnight tonight, a provision Sylvia had insisted on, and that Arthur had not been able to argue against, given the Perivale documentation. His personal assets, as defined by the prenuptial agreement, remained intact: the investment portfolio, the personal bank accounts, the art collection that had been registered in his name alone prior to the marriage. The Hilton Head property and the Scottsdale property held through Perivale were frozen pending the federal review. "What's the realistic timeline on the federal piece?" Richard asked. "Dana's best estimate is 6 to 18 months before you see any formal action, if there is formal action. Cooperation will matter. The referral note in the findings is explicit about that." Arthur set the document down. "Richard, I want to say something to you that is outside my professional capacity." Richard looked at him. "I have represented you for 11 years. In that time, I have seen you do things that were impressive and things that were not, which is true of every client I've ever had. What happened in that courtroom today was not a failure of legal strategy. It was the conclusion of a set of choices that were made over a very long time." He paused. "I'm not saying this to add to what you're carrying. I'm saying it because the next decision you make, how you cooperate, how you conduct yourself in the federal process, how you speak publicly about what happened, those decisions are still yours. That part hasn't been taken from you." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I know. All right." Arthur straightened his papers. "Then let's talk about what comes next." What came next, in the immediate and practical sense, was a phone call Richard had been dreading since the moment the gavel came down. He made it at 5:15, sitting in Arthur's conference room with the door closed and his jacket over the back of a chair and his phone in his hand. The call was to James Whitfield, Hayes Global's chairman of the board. James Whitfield was 67 years old and had been on Hayes Global's board for 9 years, recruited by Richard himself because James had the specific combination of operational experience and institutional relationships that Richard had wanted anchoring the board's senior tier. He was a measured man, deliberate in speech and decision, and he picked up on the second ring. "Richard," he said. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who has already been briefed and is now receiving the formal call as a courtesy. "You've been told," Richard said. "Sylvia Rostova's office contacted our general counsel at 2 o'clock. We've been in an emergency session since 3. A pause. "I'm sorry, Richard. I mean that genuinely. This is not how any of us wanted this to go." "I know. The board's position is that we need to move immediately on the transition. The general counsel is concerned about the federal referral and what it means for the company's regulatory standing. We have 3 institutional clients whose contracts include material adverse change clauses that could be triggered if we don't demonstrate stable leadership within James. Richard stopped him. I'm not going to fight the transition. That's why I'm calling. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not through attorneys. A pause on the other end, longer than expected. That's Richard, that's the right call. And I want you to know that what you built here is real. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the legal findings, the company is real, and 800 people have real jobs because you held this thing together for 14 years. That doesn't go away. Richard closed his eyes for a second. Of all the things he had heard in the past 36 hours, that landed somewhere specific. Thank you, James. Who do you want to know tonight among the senior team? Nobody tonight. Let me handle the announcement my way tomorrow. Give me that. James was quiet for a moment. You have until 9 tomorrow morning. After that, the general counsel needs to move. 9 tomorrow. Thank you. He ended the call and sat alone in the conference room for a few minutes. The building outside Arthur's windows was settling into its late afternoon rhythms, people leaving the particular frequency of a city moving from its working day into its evening. Richard watched it without seeing it. He was thinking about the senior team, Marcus Trent, his head of operations, who had been with him for 11 years, Caroline Huang, his head of client development, who had come to Hayes Global from a competitor and turned the Southeast client portfolio into the strongest division in the company. David Park, his CFO, the one who had replaced Patricia Ellison 2 years ago, the one who had presumably not known about Paraveil and would now have to conduct the internal accounting of it alongside the federal review. These were people he had built something with, real people doing real work inside something real that he had genuinely created. The trust structure did not change that. Vivian's 51% did not change that. What he had taken from the company did not unmake what the company had become, but it changed what he was inside it. And the board was right that it had to change his position inside it. He understood that. He was beginning slowly and with effort to understand most of the things he needed to understand. He left Arthur's office at 5:50 and drove himself home for the first time in recent memory. His driver had been notified of the change in situation by Arthur's office, and Richard had told Arthur that he preferred to make his own arrangements going forward. Small reconfigurations of daily life that were symptoms of the larger reconfiguration. He noticed them the way you notice the physical symptoms of something internal as surface evidence of something deeper that you cannot yet fully see. The Buckhead house was quiet. It was always quiet now. Vivian had moved out 4 months ago at the beginning of the formal separation, and her absence had reorganized the house's silence in a way Richard had never quite adjusted to. Her presence had not been loud. It had never been loud, but it had been palpable. The specific weight of another person's life being lived in proximity to yours, the sounds and rhythms and small daily signals that constitute cohabitation were gone, and the house carried their absence in every room. He sat in the kitchen, which was not a room he had particularly strong feelings about, and he called his daughter. Meredith Hayes was 23, living in Brooklyn, working at an architecture firm that she had chosen with the same deliberate independence she had applied to every major decision since she was 16. She and Richard had a relationship that was warm in its better periods and carefully managed in its worse ones, and she had known about the divorce proceedings since the filing date because Richard had told her, and she had responded with the measured, watchful concern of a young woman who loves both her parents and understands that love is not the same as agreement. She picked up immediately. "Dad?" Her voice was careful in the way it was careful when she was managing what she felt. "Hey, Bug." He had called her that since she was 4. It was the one piece of unreconstructed softness in his conversational register. "You've heard?" "Mom called me at noon. She was okay. She sounded okay." A pause. "Are you okay?" "Not entirely," he said, "but I'm working on it." "Dad?" She took a breath. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." "All right. The money. The $14 million. Did you know it was wrong when you were doing it?" The question sat between them on the line. Richard had been preparing for it without knowing he was preparing for it, And now that it was here, he understood that there was only one answer available that did not make everything worse. "I told myself it wasn't," he said. "I had a story I told myself about it. But underneath the story, yes, I knew." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he became aware of his own heartbeat. "Okay," Meredith said finally. Her voice was different now, not cold, not warm. Something in between that was working through something in real time. "Okay, I appreciate that you said it. I'm sorry, Bug, for all of it. I know." Another pause. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to cooperate with the federal process. I'm going to handle the transition at the company without making it ugly. And I'm going to figure out what comes next, which I don't know yet." "That sounds right," she said. "That sounds like the right order." He almost said something about her mother. He stopped himself. Whatever Meredith and Vivian were to each other in the aftermath of this was their relationship to navigate, not his to shape. "Call me tomorrow," she said, "after the company announcement. I want to know how it goes." "I will." He set the phone down and sat in the kitchen for a long time. At 7:22 the next morning, Richard walked into the Hayes Global offices on Peachtree Street for what he understood would be one of his last times as its chief executive. He had arrived early enough to be there before most of the staff, which was intentional. He had learned long ago that the timing of a difficult conversation is as important as its content, and he wanted to speak to the senior team before the building filled with the particular anxiety that organizational news produces when it arrives through unofficial channels. Marcus Trent was already at his desk. He looked up when Richard appeared in his doorway, and his expression did the thing that faces do when they have been anticipating something, and it has now arrived, a simultaneous release of tension and gathering of it. "You should have called me last night," Marcus said. "I needed last night to be last night," Richard said. "Can you pull Caroline and David into the conference room in 20 minutes? Just the three of you." Yes, of course." Marcus stood. "Richard, how bad is it?" "It's real," Richard said. "I'll explain it all in the room, but I want you to know before you hear the formal version, I'm not going to disappear, and I'm not going to make this ugly. That's a promise." Marcus nodded slowly. "All right." 20 minutes later, Richard sat across from his three most senior lieutenants, Marcus, Caroline, and David, in the conference room where they had run hundreds of operational meetings across years of building something together. He told them everything. Not the managed version, not the version that softened the Paraveil details or framed the trust structure in language designed to minimize his culpability. Everything, in the order it had happened, and with the specific factual weight that each element carried. Marcus did not speak during the telling. He sat with his arms on the table and his eyes on Richard, and his expression doing the work of processing something significant without allowing the processing to become theater. Caroline asked two clarifying questions, precisely worded, delivered in the tone of someone who is managing their reaction by focusing on specifics. David, who, as CFO, had the most immediate professional exposure to the Paraveil disclosure, went very still in a way that Richard recognized as a man running internal calculations at speed. When Richard finished, the room held a silence that lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Not long in ordinary terms, very long in the terms of a conference room where four people have just redrawn the map of their professional lives. David spoke first. "The internal audit. We need to get ahead of it." "You do," Richard said, "and I will cooperate fully with everything the audit requires. My attorneys have already committed to that in writing." "The clients," Caroline said, "the ones with MAC clauses. The board is addressing that today. James Whitfield is taking point. Your job is to be present and steady for those conversations, not to manage the news. The news will be managed at the board level. Your job is the relationships." Caroline looked at him steadily. "You know I've spent 4 years building those relationships." "I know. That's why I'm telling you directly what happened, so you're not managing incomplete information when those calls come." She nodded. One nod, tight and controlled. Marcus had been quiet. He spoke now, and his voice had the particular texture of a man saying something he has been sitting on for a while. "There were times," he said, "when I noticed things in the vendor structure that didn't quite line up. I didn't ask. I told myself it was above my visibility." He paused. "I should have asked." "This is not on you," Richard said immediately. "I know it's not on me legally. I'm not talking about legally." Marcus looked at him. I'm saying I knew something was off and I let it go because you were the one who built this thing, and I trusted that meant it was yours to run, however you decided to run it. Another pause. That was wrong of me. Not legally. Just wrong. Richard had nothing to say to that. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him since Vivian's corridor question the morning before, and it landed in a similar place, the place that is below the reach of legal language, where the actual accounting happens. The all-staff announcement went out at 9:03, timed precisely as James Whitfield had requested. Richard had written it himself at Arthur's kitchen table between 2 and 4 in the morning while Arthur slept. It was 3 paragraphs long. It acknowledged the court findings, confirmed the transition of executive leadership, and thanked the staff with the specific, genuine gratitude of a person who means it without being able to fully articulate why. It did not use the word resignation. It used the phrase transition of leadership, which was accurate and which preserved a small dignity that Richard had decided he was entitled to preserve. The response inside the building was a specific kind of quiet. The quiet of 800 people receiving significant information simultaneously and processing it through the particular filter of their own relationship to the organization and its history. Some of them had been there from the early years. Some had joined in the middle period when Hays Global was growing fast enough that the organizational culture was being built in real time by the energy of growth itself. Some were recent enough that Richard Hays was more institutional mythology than daily presence. All of them would now be working for a company controlled by a woman. Most of them had seen exactly twice, once at the annual holiday event and once at the company's 10th anniversary celebration, who had stood beside Richard both times with the elegant, pleasant remoteness of a CEO's spouse who is not part of the operational world. The understanding of what Vivian actually was, what she had always actually been, would take time to arrive in the building. Richard knew that. It had taken him 36 hours, and it was still arriving. At 10:45, as Richard was working through the physical logistics of the office transition with his assistant Gwen, who had been with him for 8 years, and who was conducting herself with the professional composure of someone who is devastated, and has decided that devastation is not what the moment requires. His phone rang with a number he did not recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Mr. Hays?" The voice was male, measured with the specific cadence of someone who makes these calls routinely and has learned to be direct without being aggressive. "My name is Special Agent Connor Briggs. I'm with the FBI field office in Atlanta. I'm calling because we've received a referral from Fulton County Superior Court related to certain financial matters identified in a dissolution proceeding. I'd like to schedule a preliminary conversation at your earliest convenience." Richard sat down. He had known this call was coming. Dana Croft had told him it was coming. Arthur had told him it was coming. The findings document had told him it was coming in the specific legal language of referral to federal authorities. He had known it was coming, and he had prepared for it in the way you can prepare for things that are inevitable, which is to say incompletely. "I'll have my attorney contact your office today," Richard said. His voice was steady. "That works perfectly," Agent Briggs said. "We appreciate the cooperation, Mr. Hays. We'll be in touch." The call lasted 40 seconds. Gwen was looking at him from the doorway with the careful non-expression of someone who has heard enough to understand what just happened and is waiting to be told what to do with the understanding. "Get me Arthur Gable," Richard said. She nodded and disappeared. He sat in his office for 9 more days, and he thought about cooperation, about what it meant practically, what it required, how it would be measured. He thought about the $14.6 million and the 7 years over which it had moved invisibly, and with his full knowledge from the company into the offshore structure, he had convinced himself was a reasonable allocation of the value he had generated. He thought about Vivian, who had funded the company that generated that value, who had known or suspected that the value was being misallocated, and who had spent 2 years building a legal architecture precise enough to address it in a courtroom without a single raised voice, who had then in the corridor of that courthouse asked him if he was all right. He did not know what to do with Vivian. He understood that he was not supposed to do anything with Vivian. She was no longer his wife, and the company was no longer his company, and the story he had told for 17 years was no longer the operative story. She did not need him to do anything with her understanding of her. She never had. But he thought about her. He thought about the morning she had mentioned Castellan Advisory, and he had not asked. He thought about 100 dinners and 100 events and 100 conversations in which she had been present and attentive and fundamentally unreadable. And he had taken the unreadability for absence, for vacancy, for the quiet of a person with nothing to add. She had been the most present person in every room they had shared together. He had simply never learned to read the language she was present in. Arthur called back at 11:12. They discussed Agent Briggs, the preliminary conversation parameters, the scope of what cooperation would require. Arthur was precise and practical, and Richard listened with the focused attention of a man who understands that the practical is now the only territory he has meaningful influence over, and that influence is itself a form of agency. And agency is what you hold on to when everything else is being reorganized around you. At 12:30, Richard stood in his office and looked at the city through the window for a long moment. Atlanta in the early afternoon, the skyline that had been the backdrop of 14 years of building something, the particular light of a southern city in the season when the heat is beginning to gather. In the Vanguard Zenith Trust offices across town, offices that had always existed, that Richard had simply never known to look for Vivian Dalton. Hayes was meeting with the Hayes Global Board for the first time in her capacity as controlling shareholder. Sylvia had told him this would happen. The board had requested an introductory session, and Vivian had agreed. She was not walking into that room as a stranger to the company. She was walking into it as what she had always been, the person who had made it possible, finally standing in the light she had chosen for 17 years not to occupy. Richard did not know what she would say to them. He did not know what her plans were for the company, for its leadership structure, for the 800 people who had come to work that morning into an organization that was, as of 9:03, being led by an entirely different understanding of itself. What he knew was this: she would not waste it. She had never wasted anything. Every year of silence, every patient decision, every piece of infrastructure she had built around and beneath and through his story, none of it had been wasted. It had been accumulating toward a purpose she had understood clearly and held privately until the moment it needed to be spoken. He picked up the box that Gwen had quietly set on his desk, a banker's box standard size, the universal container of a professional life being relocated, and he began the specific physical work of packing 17 years into something portable. It took longer than he expected. It always does. The banker's box sat in the trunk of Richard's car for 3 days before he brought it inside. He had driven it home from Peachtree Street on the afternoon of his last day in the office, placed it in the trunk with the careful efficiency of a man performing a task he does not want to examine too closely, and then simply left it there. He knew it was there. He thought about it every time he went to the car. He was not ready to carry it through the door of the Buckhead house and set it down somewhere, because setting it down somewhere meant deciding where it belonged in a life that had not yet reorganized itself around its new shape. On the fourth morning, he opened the trunk, lifted the box, and brought it inside. He set it on the kitchen table. He did not open it. He made coffee and sat across from it and drank the coffee slowly, and the box sat there with the patient solidity of cardboard and 17 years of accumulated professional identity, and neither of them moved for a long time. His phone rang at 8:47. Dana Croft. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has scheduled the preliminary interview for next Thursday," she said. 10 in the morning. We'll need 2 hours with you Wednesday afternoon to prepare. I'll be there. Richard. A pause. "I want to say something before Thursday that I want you to have time to sit with." "Go ahead." The way people conduct themselves in these preliminary conversations sets a tone that is very difficult to reverse. I've watched people walk into rooms like the one you're walking into next Thursday and make the decision, consciously or not, to manage the truth rather than tell it. Every single time that decision costs them more than the truth would have. She paused again. "You told Arthur on Wednesday night that you intended to cooperate fully. I want to know if that's still true now that the room is getting real." He looked at the banker's box on the table. "It's still true." "Good," she said. "Then we'll make sure Thursday goes the way it needs to go." He set the phone down and finished his coffee. Then he opened the box. Inside, a framed photo from Hayes Global's 5th anniversary celebration, the entire original team, 11 people, including Marcus, and a version of Richard that was 11 years younger and had the specific, slightly gaunt look of a person running on ambition and inadequate sleep. a copy of the first client contract he had ever signed, kept for sentimental reasons that he had never examined too closely. A small replica of the company's first industry award, a regional logistics excellence recognition from 2013 that had felt enormous at the time. A coffee mug that said, "Built Different," that Meredith had given him as a joke gift when she was 19. He held the mug for a moment, then he set it on the counter where he could see it. The first week after the announcement moved with the strange, compressed quality of time during a crisis, simultaneously endless and accelerated each day, containing more distinct emotional weather than a normal week. The calls came in a specific order that Richard had not predicted, but recognized in retrospect as the natural hierarchy of relationship depth. First, the professional acquaintances who reached out with carefully worded messages that expressed support while maintaining plausible distance from the specifics. Then the business associates who called with the more complicated energy of people calculating their own exposure to adjacency. Then, toward the end of the week, the people who actually knew him. Tom Reeves called on Friday. Tom had been Richard's college roommate, his oldest friend, the person who had been at the wedding and at Meredith's birth and at the 10-year company anniversary and at every significant marker of Richard's adult life, and who called now with the directness of someone who has decided that directness is the only thing worth offering. "I'm not going to ask how you're doing, because I can imagine how you're doing," Tom said. "I'm calling to tell you that I'm coming to Atlanta next week, and we're going to have dinner, and you're going to tell me what actually happened, not the version that's in the Business Chronicle." "You read the Chronicle piece." "I read 3 Chronicle pieces. They were thorough." A pause. "They were also pretty rough, Richard." "I know." "Is it accurate, what they reported?" "Most of it." "Most of it." "The part about the trust structure is accurate. The part about the offshore accounts is accurate. The part where they imply I was running a criminal enterprise from day one is that's their framing, not the factual record." "But the factual record isn't great." "No," Richard said. "The factual record is not great." Tom was quiet for a moment. "I've known you for 34 years. I'm not going to tell you what I think about the Paravel situation because you already know what I think, and hearing me say it isn't going to help you. What I am going to tell you is that the Richard Hayes I have known for 34 years is capable of doing better than this, and the fact that he didn't for 7 years is something he's going to have to sit with for a very long time. And sitting with it is actually the correct thing to do. I know that. I know you know it. I'm saying it anyway because you need to hear it from someone who isn't being paid to manage your legal exposure." Another pause. "Tuesday. I'll be there at 7. Make sure there's decent wine." "Tom." "What?" "Thank you." Tom made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but carried the warmth of one. "Don't thank me. Just be honest with me Tuesday. That's all I want." Across town in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on West Peachtree, Vivian Dalton Hayes was in the third of what had become a daily series of operational briefings with Hayes Global's senior leadership team. She had been meeting with them every morning at 8:30 since the day after the court findings, and the meetings had evolved over the week from the cautious, formal exchanges of people establishing a new working relationship into something that had more of the texture of actual work. She had not come into those rooms performing authority. That was the first thing the senior team had noticed, and Marcus Trent had said as much to Carolyn Huang on Wednesday afternoon in the kind of candid corridor conversation that reveals more about an organization than any formal meeting. She had come in prepared. She had read the operational reports, the client files, the quarterly projections, and the internal postmortems on the 2 divisions that had underperformed the previous year. She had asked specific questions and listened to the answers with the full, undivided attention of someone for whom listening is not a courtesy, but a methodology. Caroline had walked into Tuesday's meeting prepared to be cautious, which was her default approach to new executive relationships, and which had served her well across a career built on client trust. She walked out of it with the specific, unguarded respect that professionals develop when they encounter someone who is genuinely competent at a thing that matters. She already knew about the Brennan account situation, Caroline told Marcus afterward. Not the surface version, the actual operational history. She asked me what I thought went wrong, and then she listened to the whole answer without redirecting once. Marcus had nodded. She's been doing that across the board. David said the same thing about the audit conversation. How long do you think she's been paying attention? Marcus thought about it. My honest guess since the beginning. He was right, though he did not yet know the specific shape of how right he was. Vivian had been receiving operational summaries through Castellan Advisory since the company's third year, when it had become clear that Hayes Global was not a short-term investment, but a long-term enterprise whose health she had a genuine stake in understanding. She had never interfered. She had used the information to inform the 3 capital interventions that Patricia Ellison had described in her testimony, the moments when the company had needed stability, and stability had arrived through channels Richard had not examined. She had also used it to watch, to understand the company's strengths and its vulnerabilities and the specific ways in which Richard's considerable abilities were offset by the specific ways in which he was blind. She had watched the Paraveil structure emerge in the financial data over its first 2 years, and she had made a decision, a hard one not made lightly, about when and how to address it. She had not made that decision out of anger. People who observed her in those first board meetings, watching her move through the operational material with focused efficiency, might have concluded that she was a woman who did not feel things strongly. They would have been wrong. She felt things very strongly. She had simply spent a great deal of her life learning the difference between feeling something and being governed by it. On Thursday morning of the second week, Vivian arrived at the Hayes Global offices at 7:45 minutes before the first scheduled briefing and went directly to the office that had been Richard's and that was now being prepared for the interim CEO, a woman named Helen Park, who had been recruited from a competing firm and who would be on site the following Monday. The office had been cleared. The furniture was the same. The city view was the same. Vivian stood in the room for perhaps 2 minutes. She was not being sentimental. She was doing what she always did when she entered a new operational reality. She was taking its measure, understanding its dimensions, its weight, its specific character, preparing to inhabit it with the full attention it deserved. Then she walked out and went to the conference room and began the morning briefing. The FBI interview happened on a Thursday exactly as scheduled. Richard arrived at the Federal Building on Ted Turner Drive with Dana Croft and Arthur Gable at 9:52. The lobby had the institutional neutrality of all federal spaces. It communicated nothing about the specific nature of what happened inside it, which was itself a kind of communication. Agent Briggs was 38, measured in the specific way of someone trained to be measured, and he conducted the interview with 2 colleagues whose roles were to listen and document. Richard answered every question. He answered them with the precision that Dana had coached him toward: not more than was asked, not less than was truthful, the disciplined accuracy of a man who has decided that the story he tells from this point forward will be as close as he can make it the true one. The interview lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. It covered the Paraveil structure from its inception, the invoice mechanism, the expense categorization, the property acquisitions. It covered Richard's understanding at each stage of whether what he was doing was proper. That last question was the one that required the most from him, not because the answer was complicated, but because telling the true answer out loud in a federal interview room to people who were writing it down was the most irreversible version of accountability he had yet encountered. He told it anyway. When they broke at 1:15, Dana walked with Richard to the elevator with the quiet efficiency of an attorney whose client has just performed well under difficult conditions. "You did exactly what you needed to do," she said. "It didn't feel like performance," Richard said. "I know, that's why it worked." In the elevator going down, he thought about the first Chronicle piece Tom had mentioned. He had read it himself twice with the experience of reading something about yourself written by someone who has access to the factual record, but not to the interior of the experience. The piece was accurate in the way that factual accounts of complicated human events are accurate. It captured what happened without capturing what it felt like from inside the happening, which is not a criticism of journalism, but simply a description of what journalism can and cannot do. The second Chronicle piece, which had run 4 days later, had focused on Vivian. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Okonkwo, who covered business and legal affairs, had clearly done extensive document research, and the piece reconstructed the trust structure and Vivian's role in Hayes Global's founding with the kind of careful specificity that suggested Sarah Okonkwo had understood she was writing about something that was going to matter. The headline had been "The Silent Partner Who Owned It All." Richard had read that one 3 times. Meredith called the evening after the FBI interview. She had been calling every 2 or 3 days with the careful consistency of someone maintaining a connection across a complicated distance, and Richard had come to understand that these calls were one of the most important things currently happening in his life. "How did it go today?" she asked. "Hard, but okay." "Dana said it went well. She texted me." A pause. "I hope that's all right. I asked her to." Richard smiled slightly at nothing in particular. "It's all right." "Dad, I want to say something, and I need you to hear it without immediately responding." "Okay." "I talked to Mom yesterday, for a long time, like 2 hours." Meredith's voice had the quality of someone navigating terrain they have mapped carefully in advance. "She's not angry, Dad. I know you probably think she's angry, or that she should be, or whatever version of that you're running. But she's not. She's actually really settled, like more settled than I've ever heard her." Richard said nothing. He was honoring the instruction. "She said something that I've been thinking about ever since. She said she spent 17 years loving you and the company and the idea of what you were building together, even though only one of you knew it was together. She said the hardest part wasn't the end. The hardest part was the middle, all those years of watching you take credit for something she was quietly holding up and choosing every day not to say anything and living with that choice." Meredith paused. "She said she doesn't regret it. She said she made the choice she made and she'd make it again because she believed in the company and she believed in what it could be, and it became that. She needed to do it her way." Richard closed his eyes. "She also said, and this is the part I really need you to hear, she said that she hopes you find your way through this. Not as a courtesy, she means it." "I know she means it," Richard said quietly. "That's somehow the hardest part." "I know," Meredith said. "I know Dad." 3 weeks after the court findings on a Tuesday morning that arrived with the ordinary indifference of all significant mornings, Vivian Dalton Hayes stood in the main conference room of Hayes Global's Atlanta headquarters and addressed the full senior leadership team for the first time in a formal capacity. 14 people around the table plus 3 joining by video from the Charlotte and Dallas offices. Helen Park, the incoming CEO, sat to Vivian's right with the attentive posture of a new executive who understands that this particular moment is one to watch rather than lead. Vivian had prepared what she wanted to say, but she did not use notes. She rarely used notes. She had found over the years that the things worth saying are the things you have thought about long enough to carry internally. She thanked the team for their steadiness during the transition. She said it without the hollow performativity of corporate communication, said it directly and specifically, acknowledging that the past 3 weeks had required them to absorb significant organizational disruption while maintaining the client relationships and operational functions that constituted the company's actual work. She said she had watched them do that, and she was not taking it for granted. Then she told them the truth about who she was. Not the full history that would come in time through documents and conversations, and the gradual process by which organizational myth gets revised by documented reality. But the essential truth that she had been part of this company's life since before it had a name, that her investment had been genuine and her interest ongoing, and that what she intended now was not disruption, but continuation. The continuation of something real that 800 people had built across 14 years, and that deserved to keep being built. Marcus Trent, seated 4 chairs down on her left, watched her speak with the expression of a man recalibrating a significant number of assumptions simultaneously. He had been doing that for 3 weeks. He suspected he would be doing it for a while longer. "I want to be honest with you about one more thing," Vivian said, and the room shifted its attention in the specific way rooms do when they recognize that something direct is coming. What happened with this company's finances under the previous executive structure was wrong. It was a harm to this organization and to everyone in it. I am not going to paper over it with language designed to make it easier to process. It was wrong. She paused. What I can tell you is that the company's financial foundation is sound. The trust has assets sufficient to support the operational continuity and growth plans we've been discussing this week. Hayes Global is not going to collapse. Hayes Global is going to continue, and it is going to be led by people. She looked briefly at Helen Park, who understand that the trust this company has earned from its clients and its employees is not a renewable resource. It has to be protected every day. The room was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then David Park, the CFO, the one who had gone still in the conference room 3 weeks ago when Richard had disclosed the Paravel details, said something that no one in the room had expected him to say. "Mrs. Hayes, can I ask you something directly? Please. You've known about this company for 17 years. You've watched it from a distance, funded it, stabilized it 3 times when it should have gone under. And you never once in any of those years came into a room like this one and said any of what you just said." He was not accusatory. He was genuinely asking. "Why now?" Vivian looked at him steadily. "Because now is when it's necessary," she said. "I've learned over the years that the right moment to speak is not the moment when speaking is merely possible. It's the moment when speaking changes something that needs to change." She paused. This company needed the leadership structure it now has. It needed the financial transparency it now has. It needed this conversation. She looked around the table. Everything before today was preparation for this room. "That's the honest answer." David nodded slowly. "That's a very patient way to operate." "It is," she said. "Patience is not the same as passivity. I want everyone in this room to understand that distinction clearly, because this company is going to be run by people who understand it." That afternoon, Vivian sat in what had become her working office in the building, not Richard's former office, which she had chosen to leave for Helen Park, but a smaller room on the same floor that looked out toward Midtown, and she called her mother. Eleanor Dalton was 78, living in Savannah, in the house where Vivian had grown up, and she answered the phone with the warmth of a woman who has been waiting for a particular call for a long time. "How did it go?" Eleanor asked. "It went the way it needed to go." "Were you nervous?" Vivian thought about it honestly. "Before I walked in, yes. Once I started talking, no." "That's always been true of you," Eleanor said, "since you were 7 years old. You'd stand at the edge of something and seem unsure, and then you'd step in and everything would settle." A pause. "Your grandfather would have loved today." Vivian felt the particular warmth that James Dalton's name always produced, a warmth that was also a kind of ache, the way you feel about people who shaped you and are no longer there to see the shape they made. "I know," she said. "He always said you were the one who understood what the money was for," Eleanor said. "Not for accumulating, for building things that last." He was right. He usually was. Her mother's voice carried a smile. "Come to Savannah this weekend. I'll make the thing you like." "The shrimp. The shrimp. I'll be there Saturday morning." She set the phone down and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office. Outside, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta does in the late afternoon, moving building, conducting the continuous busy project of a city that has never been particularly interested in standing still. She thought about Richard. She thought about him with the specific compassion that is available to a person who has processed their grief and their anger and their long, complicated history with someone and come out the other side into something cleaner and more honest than either of those things. She hoped he would find his way through. She meant it the way she had told Meredith she meant it, not as a courtesy, but as a genuine wish extended across the distance that now existed between them, which was the right distance. She thought about this morning everything had begun. Not the courtroom morning, but the real beginning. The morning in 2007, when Richard had come to her with a legal pad full of ideas and a conviction so intense it was almost physical, and she had looked at him and seen both the genuine talent and the genuine blindness and made her decision. She had made it with full knowledge. She had funded something she believed in, married someone she loved, and spent 17 years doing both of those things simultaneously in the knowledge that they were more complicated together than either was alone. She did not regret the company. She did not regret the marriage, not entirely. Meredith existed because of it, and Meredith was the best thing in her life. What she regretted was the years spent waiting for Richard to see her, which was a regret she had made her peace with, because waiting for someone to see you is ultimately a choice you make, and she had made it with her eyes open. She was done waiting. That was the part that felt 3 weeks after walking out of courtroom 7 into the Atlanta sunlight most completely and irreversibly true. She was done waiting for the right moment to be herself, fully in rooms where the people present needed to understand who she was. She had spent half her adult life being the woman behind the story. She was now simply the story. On the morning of Richard Hayes' first formal meeting with federal prosecutors, a meeting that Dana Croft had spent 2 weeks preparing him for, and that he entered with the specific earned composure of a man who has decided that honesty is not a strategy, but a necessity. He sat in the car outside the federal building for 4 minutes before going in. He was thinking about something Meredith had said to him the previous weekend when she had come to Atlanta, and they had sat in the kitchen for 6 hours, talking in the way that parents and adult children sometimes talk when a crisis has stripped away the usual social management and left something more honest in its place. She had said, "The thing I keep coming back to is that you built something real, Dad. Whatever happened around it, whatever you took that you shouldn't have the company is real. 800 people, 14 years, that's real. And I think you've been so deep in what you did wrong that you can't hold both things at once. But you have to be able to hold both things because the both things is what's true." He had not been able to respond immediately. He had sat with it for a long moment and then said, "When did you get this wise?" And she had said without a trace of irony, "I had good teachers. Both of them." He got out of the car and walked into the federal building. He answered every question. He told the full story, not the story he had told for 17 years in boardrooms and interviews and at dinner tables where his wife sat beside him and never corrected a word, but the story underneath that story, the one that included all the parts he had spent 7 years not examining because examination was inconvenient and confidence was easier. He told it because it was true. He told it because Dana Croft was right, that the truth costs less than its management. He told it because he was at 51 years old, finally more interested in what was real than in what was comfortable. And across town, in an office on the 14th floor of a building on West Peachtree, Vivian Dalton Hayes opened her laptop, reviewed the morning's operational report, and began the work of building something that had always been hers this time, with everyone in the room fully aware of exactly who was building it. She had known exactly where to put herself all along. Now the world finally knew it too.